welcome for the next 90 minutes. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Pam Buffington here at EDC, who is the facilitator of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance, to take it away this afternoon. Good afternoon, Pam.
Thank you, Peter. I want to welcome everyone to the Building a Culture of Data Use in Rural Districts Skill Builder webinar. I'm going to start by introducing our presenters today. As Peter said, they are Candace Bacala and Susan Henry. Candace Bacala is a research associate at WestEd, where she works on research, evaluation, and technical assistance projects related to educator effectiveness, professional development, and data use in education. She earned her EDD from Harvard Grad School of Education, where she has worked with the DataWise project on supporting schools and districts with using data for improvement since 2009. Previously, Candace taught elementary school in Washington, D.C. Joining her will be Susan Henry. Susan is a senior program associate at WestEd, where she works on a range of technical assistance and professional development projects, including supporting teachers' data use through locally developed assessments and formative assessment practices in the classroom. A former National Board Certified teacher with expertise in interdisciplinary and project-based curricula, Susan taught in schools for over 20 years and was a leader in the development of 2 new schools. She earned her EDD at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she worked with Candace on the DataWise project. I'm going to now give a quick overview of today's agenda. As you are noticing, we're beginning with a welcome and overview. Then we will kick into the Culture of Data Use framework, where we will go over elements 1 and 2. Then we will move to a vignette, specifically around a rural high-poverty K-12 district. We will then move into element 3 and 4. Then that will be followed by a vignette, high-achieving K-8 rural school, and then finally element 5, which is leading a culture of data use, closing and reflection. Before I hand this over to Candace, I just want to reinforce what Peter said multiple times. Please add questions to the chat. Both Angela and I will be monitoring the chat, and there'll be opportunities for us to pause and ask questions. If you find you have a question in any one of these sections of the agenda, ask them and we can pause before moving on to answer those questions. So thank you very much. And Candace, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Pam. This is Candace Bocala, and I'd like to remind you that this workshop, this webinar, is built on a brand new toolkit that you can download for free. It's a publicly available resource that was developed by our colleagues Nancy Gerzon and Sarah Guckenberg, and it was recently published by the Institute of Education Sciences. This toolkit is not specific to rural schools, but the 2 examples that we'll be presenting today are from real rural schools and districts that the authors have worked with. And those example vignettes are presented in the toolkit in addition to others from urban and suburban schools so that you could use them in your context. The toolkit also outlines how you might facilitate this workshop in your own settings, and it comes with a facilitator's guide. Today for the webinar, our guiding questions are going to be, what does the research tell us about effective district and school data practices? What do schools and districts with an effective culture of data use do? What does it look like? And what is the role of district and school level guidance to support systemic change in data use practices? And finally, which of these practices can be applied in your own setting to either deepen or extend your current practice? So as we go through the content today, we'd like you to keep these questions in mind. And more specifically, our goals for this afternoon are to help our participants understand how a framework can help leaders in rural districts develop more effective practices, policies, and guidelines that will enhance your culture of data use over time. We're going to spend most of our time digging into the 5 elements that are based from research, but also based from examples of, as I said, real schools and districts, and to consider possible strategies to strengthen each of those 5 elements.
So our aim in today's session is to focus on a strategic approach to data use for improved teaching and learning. So with that in mind, we'd like you to consider a few questions. What is effective data use? What do we mean by culture? And when these two terms are put together, what's the definition of a culture of data use? These two definitions here of data literacy both reflect effective data use to support teaching and learning. The first describes data literacy as a process for educational decision-making that integrates data analysis across school and classroom levels. The educational data referenced here suggests a focus on student learning data. The second definition emphasizes understanding the properties and use of data to inform practice, meaning instructional practices in the classroom. But to ensure effective data use, is it enough to have educators with good data literacy skills? Research suggests that data literacy skills are foundational, but they're insufficient unto themselves to ensure broad and effective data use. So we would like to take a minute here to think beyond this. And we'd like to invite you to jot into the chat space in response to this question here. Beyond good data literacy skills, what else is necessary to ensure that data are used throughout an organization on a regular basis to guide improvement? So as you jot some thoughts into the chat box about what you think here, we'd like to encourage you to think about what kinds of infrastructure might be needed, or perhaps policies or guidelines. Leadership's always important, but what aspects of leadership are essential to attend to for ongoing data use? In particular, what kinds of professional development supports might be necessary? Are there key aspects of a school's climate or culture that need to be in place? So let's take a minute to hear your thoughts in the chat about what else is necessary beyond data literacy skills. So access to data is a key place. Thank you, Sam and Odelia. That is an element we're going to speak more about in just a minute. Being planful and systematic, Marianne writes about your approach to data use is key, and I think that falls in the leadership realm. Leadership being broadly defined. So there's other references here to the role of leadership in this work. Data specialists, and having a unified vision. Again, this is often led by the leadership in a district, and we'll talk about some of that. Understanding the limitations of any given data set, that's a really important piece. That is related to data literacy and sometimes to assessment literacy. And establishing regular routines for data cycles, data use, which we talk about in another webinar, actually another resource, which Candace will reference in a little while. And the quality of the data matter too, making sure that you can draw valid inferences from the data sets that you have. So please continue to share your thoughts as we move on. You're identifying many of the contributors to a culture of data use as described in the framework we're about to present. But what do we really mean by culture? Well, culture is so pervasive that it becomes what some people call just the way we do business, or here what Jeffrey Wayman describes as the way things are done when nobody's looking. In applying Jeffrey Wayman's definition of culture to thinking about what makes a culture of data use, a few things come to mind. So in a context of data use, culture implies that data use takes place throughout an organization at all levels in a way that's part of how business gets done. In the context of data use, you could say that culture refers to organizational perceptions, beliefs, values, and practices related to data use. And the data use practices are not seen as sort of another thing that's layered on to many other responsibilities, but instead it's seen as an essential integrated tool to getting the daily work of teaching and learning done well. So in these ways, a culture of data use implies that there is more in place than just data literacy skills. This workshop is going to look closely at just what is in place in schools and districts with effective cultures of data use, so you can think more about how to establish and deepen these cultures in your own local context. So this definition of the culture of data use provided by Dave Ronca and his colleagues starts to unpack several aspects of culture that contribute to broad and embedded data use for improvement. And that will ground the rest of our work today during this session. As I read a more complete version of this definition, I'd like to invite you again to jot into the chat box any key words here that really align well with your own ideas of a culture of data use. So Dave Ronca and his colleagues write that a strong data culture results when an organization believes in continuous improvement and regularly puts that belief into practice. Schools and districts that have strong data cultures emphasize collaboration as a keystone for success, and they empower teachers and administrators to make decisions for which they will be held accountable. Elements of a strong data culture include commitment from all stakeholder groups to make better use of data, a clearly articulated vision for data use, which is something someone just mentioned in the chat, beliefs about the efficacy of teaching and the value of data in improving teaching and learning, accountability for results coupled with empowering teachers to make instructional changes, a culture of collaboration at all levels and across all levels, modeling of data use by school and district leaders, and commitment to making ongoing instructional and programmatic improvements. Some of the words that you noted here resonate with this definition here. Well, collaboration is a big piece that a lot of schools work actively on, and there are specific tools and protocols to support productive collaboration around data. Continuous improvement is a very embedded piece of this work, and the commitment to visions and beliefs, these cultural elements that are really infused in an organization are key to this definition of a culture of data use. So you have a sense of culture here, meaning that the organizational systems and structures are in place to ensure that data use is ongoing, it supports continuous improvement, and it happens as an embedded practice even when nobody's looking. So this slide here, adapted from research by Barbara Means, Padilla, and Gallagher from 2010, highlights a continuum of practice and the types of activities that might be seen at each of 3 stages of development. So try to consider here which of these stages most closely represent data use in your school or district context. So in stage 1, school improvement teams and school leaders use primarily state assessment data to inform their decision making. And state assessment data might inform curriculum decisions, for example, or teacher and student placement decisions. Often during this stage, there's a heavy reliance on state assessment and accountability data, in part because there may be limited access to other types of data. There's typically very little use of data to guide instructional decisions or classroom actions in stage 1. In stage 2, there's initial use of other types of data, and users apply data to decisions about what to teach. So data are reviewed to see whether specific standards have been met or to determine how subgroups are performing. And data use strategies focus on analysis of curriculum and standards to ensure that key standards are being addressed and to determine whether specific students or subgroups should be retaught or supported with additional content or instructional time. In this stage, there's often a new reliance on benchmarks or interim assessments, with the overarching focus being on what is being taught and to whom. In the 3rd stage, the primary focus is on instructional practices or how to teach. Educators are using data more frequently here, and additional data are available to provide information on current student performance. Data analysis strategies are focused on looking at assessment data to determine which instructional actions benefited which students, and the most and on exploring ways to link this analysis to deliberate improvements to instruction. There's also increasing focus on more formative types of classroom data, which are seen as a tool to support daily shifts in teaching and learning. So what happens at the next stage, after stage 3? In stage 4, teachers use student achievement data formatively to understand what students know and can do through daily embedded classroom assessments. So stage 4 work involves daily focus on evidence of student learning, especially data on what students know and what they need to address in the next steps of instruction. The data analysis skills from stages 1, 2, and 3 are evident in stage 4, but they're increasingly focused on understanding the evidence and making real-time instructional adjustments to better meet students' learning needs. So in particular, stage 4 requires a data-using culture. Back in 2009, the Data Quality Campaign pointed out that the shift from compliance-based data use over to a student-focused culture of data use involves a much greater focus on supporting people rather than just things. Therefore, support from from district and school leaders becomes increasingly important to help educators make this kind of a shift. So we'd like to move to a poll now and ask you to reflect for a moment. In the poll, would you please indicate which one of these stages most closely represents your district's or school's current data use? Let's just see where most of you might place your own schools along this continuum. See some in early stages of data use. The bulk so far falling into stage 2, where they're attending to what to teach and to whom, but that perhaps are not pursuing formative uses of data so clearly, or linking data actively to instruction, which we know from the research is a very hard bridge to cross, moving from making sense of the data to actually making changes in your instruction. And your responses so far suggest that that may be the case in many of your schools and districts. Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we will introduce the 5 elements of the Culture of Data Use framework. And I had made a reference to downloading the slides. I'll point your attention now to the Download Today's Files box, which is down below where the slides are. And you can actually download these slides. If you can see my little arrow here. You can also download the framework table that we're about to discuss. So the Culture of Data Use framework stems from the author's work in districts and schools over the past 15 years to support the implementation of various kinds of data use practices. This work yielded 5 elements, which also align well with years of research. And these 5 elements are all necessary for establishing data use practices that become cultural norms in the school or district. And I'd like to mention, before we move on, that a key idea here is the framework is helpful in organizing thinking. This is not one of those webinars where we're going to say, here are the top 2 or 3 things you have to do, but we will be giving you plenty of examples. Instead, we'd like you to consider how using a framework can help you consider where your current practice is, where are the gaps, and also where are your strengths. And together, how can you build upon each of these 5 elements to create a real systematic culture of data use? So if you look through the Culture of Data Use framework, on one side, on the top right, you'll see Making Meaning from Data. And this entry point here is all about the school finding ways to help educators make meaning from that data. On the top right, the Making Meaning from Data panel focuses on providing structures and supports for educators' collaborative inquiry and to ensure new knowledge is applied to instructional improvement. Then just below it, Building Knowledge and Skills to Use Data. That element focuses on ensuring educators are supported to explore and deepen their content knowledge and focus on building what our colleague Ellen Mandanak has called pedagogical data literacy, or the ability to apply data to instruction and assessment and specific content-based areas. Then along the left-hand side here, all of these elements are organized around the flow of communication. And the primary focus here is on expectations in the development of systems that communicate what data should be used and how. The top left panel, which is called Ensuring Access to Data, focuses on the importance of establishing systems to provide access to usable data, which was an element that folks raised in the beginning chat about what else is necessary in addition to data use. Several people said access. And then just below that, clarifying expectations for data use relates to communicating clear and consistent messages about how data use work supports improvement and builds education capacity over time. And those messages need to come from key players, key stakeholders in the system. So that leads us to our last element, which is down at the bottom, leading a culture of data use. This is the foundation. Leadership that ensures access to resources and empowers and conveys data use expectations really sets the stage for the other 4 elements to take place. And that's why leading a culture of data use is at the bottom of the framework. So this is a simple version of our framework, and you have as a handout that you can download a more elaborated version of the definitions of each of these elements. And if you download the Culture of Data Use Toolkit, you will also find these tables reproduced in that toolkit with a lot more detail. After outlining that initial set of 5 elements, the authors of this toolkit reviewed 60 research studies that were related to these factors to try to distill some key points that all districts and schools that have a supportive data using culture have in place. And this subsequent framework is the basis for your handout. And you'll notice it's intentionally neutral in relation to any specific intervention that is designed to improve the data culture. It doesn't say you should use this program or you should follow these 5 steps in this order. And that's really because there's no specific process or sequence that shows us the right way to develop a culture of data use, which is why this work is so complex. And we really don't have enough knowledge from research about which data use interventions under what circumstances are the most effective, but we do have some promising practices that we can combine when you incorporate all 5 of these elements, and that is based in research. What's key to understanding here is that all 5 elements are necessary, and we're going to be sharing some examples during the webinar to help you consider some strategies that will relate to each element. But as I mentioned, we'd like you to think about where in your practice or in the schools that you work with do you have strengths in each of these elements, and where would you like to start your next work. So for the next part of the time here, we're going to go through the framework systematically. And for each framework element, we're going to consider what do we know from the research about this element, and what are some practical, real-life suggestions for tools and guidance that we can share with you. And as I mentioned at several points, we're going to share examples of what these elements look like in 2 real rural schools that we don't give them a name, but they are out there in the world. And we also want to take a moment to acknowledge that data use in rural districts takes place within a very particular context, but we know that that context can vary. So we're interested in hearing from you what elements you think are important in rural districts. But we've heard from your pre-survey and from talking to some members of the Rural Alliance that rural districts have the following challenges. They may have limited resources for building comprehensive data systems, those large-scale data dashboards or ways that educators can get access to data. There may be limited resources for those kinds of systems. We also heard that educators in these districts wear multiple hats. Somebody is the administrator for more than one school, or they might be a classroom teacher and a data coach and the director of something else at the district. We've heard a lot about limitations due to numbers, single class sizes, single classes per grade level, or small class sizes. And so that means even smaller numbers of students in subgroups of interest, such as students with disabilities or English language learners. And it can be hard to draw inferences when there are such small numbers of students who make up the population that you're interested in. So those are some conditions that set the stage for thinking about how each of these elements operates in a rural setting. And we'd like to hear now from you, what other conditions do rural schools and districts commonly encounter that you know of from your work? And we'll take a moment and bring up the chat so that we can hear from you. while you're typing, we looked at some of your questions from the survey that you filled out in advance, and we did get a few questions about how rural districts, data use in rural districts is different from data use in urban settings. And I wouldn't say that the elements, the key elements of the framework are different, or that many of the practices are different. It's just how you utilize the resources at hand. So a few people have typed in now that with the many responsibilities, people wearing multiple hats, you might have lack of time because it's hard to convene a team together when they have schedules that don't overlap. This is related to lack of collaboration, maybe limited time that is provided. I would say that that's an element of the leadership that needs to happen where the protected time needs to come in place, and that's something we'll talk about. Having a small staff and a small support network, I think, is a real challenge. Hopefully with webinars and other means of virtual professional learning these days, we can start to broaden that out. The issues of isolation, I think, are echoed. And then going back, so it seems like there's an issue related to collaboration, but then there's also an issue related to time for that collaboration, and how do we make that happen within a school. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we present the examples from the rural districts and how they solved some of these problems. And we'd also like you to think about, when you hear these vignettes, are these solutions applicable? Could we also try them? What about those examples might work for our schools?
Feel free to continue entering those conditions in rural schools. We're interested in hearing more from you about those contexts. In the meantime, we'll continue on to think about the first element in the culture of data use framework, which is about ensuring access. Ensuring access to data. This often involves investing in data management systems that can provide timely, reliable access to different kinds of data to meet the different needs of those at varied levels in the school system. But as was noted in this Institute of Education Sciences report cited here, a good data system's just not enough. It's also really important to ensure alignment among those data systems, curriculum and assessment practices, and professional development efforts. Also, not all data worth examining can be stored in a data management system, such as daily student work samples, for example. So research suggests that districts should establish clear and reliable processes to ensure data are available in simplified and comprehensible forms, and that any data systems that are instituted are organized in ways that allow users to ask questions of the data, and particularly that allow teachers to focus on specific questions of student learning and achievement. In a national survey of data use practices conducted by Barbara Means and her colleagues in 2010, teachers relied on district, school, and data team leaders to collect and prepare data for review. They rarely prepared data on their own. When lacking effective data management systems, teachers in one study reported significant time spent compiling that data, which they felt resulted in their detracting from their time and attention to thinking about the instructional actions they might be crafting in response to that data. So a key element that increases the likelihood that data will be used for improvement is making data easily usable by those closest to instruction. In a 2010 study of urban school leadership with results that could just as well be applied to rural schools, principals in many schools used the district's data system only as a starting point, but they moved on to create their own within-school data systems to provide continuous feedback on student learning to teachers and teacher leaders. This frame of having both district and school-level data systems addresses the ideal of having differentiated access to data based on the needs of users at different levels in the system. It's important to emphasize that much of the data at your disposal is not likely to be housed in a central data management system, especially in rural schools where there may be fewer resources to institute and manage some large comprehensive data warehouse. Leaders will want to consider the full range of data that can inform programmatic and instructional decisions. So this pyramid, which is from the Data Coach's Guide by Nancy Love and her colleagues, shows that it's important to consider multiple sources of data to inform educators' understandings of students' learning. Most of the data that teams should be examining is represented toward the bottom of this pyramid, the broadest base, which includes item-level analyses and close examination of students' classroom work. In particular, studies have suggested that when this student work shows evidence of students thinking rather than just multiple choice kinds of responses, teachers gain a window to how students are understanding the concepts they're trying to teach, and they're more likely to actually change their instruction as a result. So while studies indicate that data management systems are important to support access to data throughout a district, these systems may well include within-school systems developed within schools that meet the specific needs of educators in that school, as well as accompanying processes and guidance for teacher teams to examine and track evidence of student learning based on classroom-level data. There are a number of types of guidance that can be introduced to your districts to help to ensure broad access to relevant data for programmatic or instructional decisions. This sample data inventory, this was adapted from Kathy Boudette, Liz City, and Dick Murnane's book, DataWise, provides a structured approach for not only compiling information about the varied types of data sources currently being used in schools in the district, but also it prompts consideration of how data are currently being used and how these data might be used more effectively. Other strategies to support access to data might involve establishing structures to encourage a strong bottom-up information flow from the school to the central office so that the central office personnel can provide data reports that really address the school's questions. In addition, these central office staff can move beyond just charts and numbers to preparing clear visual representations of the data, usually clearly labeled and colored graphs, for example, that can help educators begin to identify and grapple with the student learning story behind the numbers. And finally, district and school leaders can identify or advocate for personnel to support data functions, such as data entry or clerical support staff that might be shared across schools, which we'll hear about in an upcoming vignette. So review of the research on data use indicates that a good data system is not enough. School and district leaders need to participate in the flow of information. By flow of information, we mean it's a two-way exchange. In a 2012 study of central office processes related to district data use, researchers found that the role of the central office is to support both top-down and bottom-up data use. Central offices that encouraged strong bottom-up flow of information from schools had stronger evidence-based practices and were more likely to access important information from schools that then informed better central office supports to teachers over time. Remember, if we think back to the continuum and the stages of data use for improvement of practice, this means that district leaders need to create systems or predictable processes that support the timely and reliable reporting of short-cycle student assessment data. This includes recognizing the shifting role of education leaders in framing data use processes to focus on programmatic and instructional improvement rather than a more narrow focus on accountability or compliance. This also means ensuring that these processes solicit information about teachers' needs and are then acting in response to these needs.
So we had a question as you were talking, Sue, about that pyramid, and I'd actually just like to quickly answer that out loud, although I answered it in the chat. The pyramid is a way to display the importance of different forms of data that provide access to student thinking. And this pyramid was designed by Nancy Love and the authors to give you the picture that the data that gives you the most evidence about student thinking is student work, and aggregated data is actually the least helpful in terms of illuminating how students are learning and what specific strategies they might be using to solve problems. So that's why this pyramid was designed. And the question came in about, isn't it also important to collect data on the teacher's instructional actions? and we absolutely believe that is true. In fact, there's other forms of data that are not represented here, like parent survey data, student survey data, feedback from teachers to other teachers about their instruction that could be incorporated into a broader diagram for all the kinds of data you could collect. And I would absolutely say if you collect student learning data, you could also collect instructional data to show the flip side of a coin. If the student learning looks one way, if the outcomes look one way, what was the instruction that led to that outcome? So you would need some evidence about that in order to have a good conversation with the teacher. But that was a good question that came in through the chat. And so we're going to move on through the rest of the framework onto element 2. And element 2 is about clarifying expectations, which is one of those elements of culture that we often don't think about, but when it's missing, you can definitely have a gap in trying to support data use. This is an emphasis on communication. Multiple studies point to recommendations for districts to establish a clear vision for data use, with some recommending that this vision include a written plan that even articulates activities, roles, and responsibilities of all the data users in the system. Setting expectations at the district level is an important role for central office leaders. Research suggests that establishing consistent data use practices that are used at the principal and school levels appears to support more focused data use practice by teachers. So central office administrators play an informal role in disseminating understandings based on the development of positive and trusting relational networks within the district. And we also know that multiple studies, that this idea of relational trust within schools is an important prerequisite for data use. And the ways that principals and teacher leaders communicate and model clear expectations builds relational trust, and especially builds teachers' comfort and willingness to engage in data use practices. It's also important to note that expectations are communicated by principals and teacher leaders in multiple ways. So one example could be a schedule change that promotes time for teacher reflection and dialogue. For example, to help them address data-driven inquiry and improvement. Those schedule changes indicate that those kinds of inquiries have value and will be supported through structured and protected time. So many of you pointed out in your chat earlier that a drawback or a common element where rural districts lack is this structured and protected time. And I don't think that's common only in rural districts. I think that's an issue we struggle with in education broadly. So as you think about what could be done differently, do you have a way to document all of these expectations that are coming out about data use? And do you provide the schedules and structured time in order for those meetings to take place? One example that we'd like to present here is what the authors called the School Data Review. So if you take a look, you can see just the heading rows here and the examples of the kinds of elements you would write inside the columns, although it's kind of hard to read, and we understand that. And if you download the toolkit, you can see this review in its entirety. This is one example of how a district data leadership team can work with schools to clarify expectations. And you'll notice along the top that one of the things is that there is a schedule for when data analysis happens. So they went through and looked at all the data analysis tasks and tried to decide, does this happen in the beginning of the year? Does it happen multiple times through the year? Or does it happen every 2 or 3 weeks? And the other thing you'll notice is this column here, which demonstrates what's the focus for analysis. Something I've seen a lot when working with schools is teams will gather and data will be put in front of them, but they won't actually understand why are we looking at this data. And so a district can go through a process of setting expectations by providing a focus for that analysis that is conveyed to the school teams. So just a quick moment while we point out here some other examples of data use practices that support clarifying expectations, and then we're going to ask you what some effective strategies you have used in your settings. Some other examples might be writing data use policy that outlines expectations for each role. For example, how are students going to use their data? How are teachers going to use data? Do parents use data? How about administrators? Ensuring that school leaders explicitly acknowledge that teachers have a wealth of knowledge as a starting point for their data discussions and communicating that to them, acknowledging, we know you as teachers have so much experience that you bring to this and it's valued. Another way to set expectations is to intentionally model how you expect teachers to talk to each other about the data, including professional norms of discourse, and then to set the tone for internal accountability or mutual accountability among staff members to ensure that data review meetings are purposeful and that everybody has an understanding that this will lead to instructional practice. So, after hearing a couple of different strategies that we've learned about from our research and practice, what are some strategies you have used in your role? And here we'd love to hear you introduce yourself a little bit by prefacing your comment with what role you have. So if you are a teacher, go ahead and write teacher and then a colon and then write your idea. So as you think about your work, have you encountered effective strategies that clarify data use expectations? Do you have role descriptions, for example, for what a data team is supposed to do and what the roles are on that data team? Do you know administrators who have created schedules like the ones that I just showed you, where it has a table of how often the groups will meet and what they will be examining? Another example is, do you have a way for administrators or teacher leaders to model the professional norms or ways of talking about data that then teachers can use with each other? And have you seen good examples of that? And don't forget to tell us what your role is so we can try to put you in your appropriate category. So we have a comment here from Leslie, who's a former math and data specialist. And the example is incorporating data collection and analysis into a formal RTI design review protocol. So that's great. The example of having a formal RTI protocol sets the expectation that this is the way we're going to be using data within our response to intervention or RTI process. And then somebody had mentioned that they see expectations set through the use of protocols in general. We'll spend some time in a moment talking about the value of protocols because that's a good example. An example from a regional support consultant, Marianne, is about data playbooks. I think that's a really interesting idea, Marianne. If you want to put more detail in, I'd love to hear about it. What would go into a data playbook? And then Alyssa, literacy coach, has a formal PLC meeting every other week, and they have agendas. So agendas are good ways to set expectations. And then after the assessments, they have meetings to discuss strengths, weaknesses, and future actions. So it sounds like they also have a process for helping their teachers work through the data. So go ahead and keep on entering in your ideas, and those of you who are listening in or watching the chat, think about whether you could adopt some of these ideas to clarify expectations at your schools. And I'll move back now to the summary slide here. So overall, just remembering that this element is all about communication, and we want to emphasize that the research shows that developing an effective communication plan sets clear and professional expectations for data use at multiple levels through the district. So it's key that leaders establish and communicate that common orientation toward evidence-based decision-making and how this approach will contribute to improvement in student learning. And I've been seeing the word leaders and administrators a lot and teacher leaders, but we think that it's important that these expectations should be co-constructed through sustained conversations with leaders, teachers, and other roles in the district, and that it's important to remember that these professional expectations will shift over time as people develop and grow. So sometimes if you find you've written that data team description maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it's time to return to that and update it.
Okay, so now we're going to move into sharing one brief vignette that illustrates how one rural high-poverty K-12 district tackled these first two elements of the framework, ensuring access to data and clarifying expectations for data use. As I describe this district's efforts, would you please jot some notes just on a nearby sheet of paper about the critical behaviors that you notice supported the district's ability to strengthen either of these two elements? And we'll ask you to share your observations on the next couple of slides. You'll hear about a lot of activities that the district did, but we'd like you to really pay attention to the core patterns of behavior that made these activities successful. For example, you'll notice that in the first year of this district's work, they solicited information about teachers' data use. They did this in several ways, but the core behavior was that they went out and made sure they learned how teachers were actually using data. So I want to just note that the photos we're using here are just random schools. They're not actually the rural schools we're describing here. Their names were kept anonymous. So at the start, this rural district had a limited data infrastructure and had recently implemented an off-the-shelf student information system, which had numerous technical glitches. I can imagine that some of you might know what that's about, and was poorly understood within the district. So the local high school technology teacher, as we said before, and often these folks will wear multiple hats. In this district, the local high school technology teacher served as the district's technology director as well. And he knew a lot about software, but he knew quite little about infrastructure. The district had one K-8 literacy coach who traveled across 3 schools, but otherwise they had no data coaches and had limited financial resources. So when a new district superintendent arrived, she recognized that data use practices were extremely limited at both the district office and at the classroom level. So early on, she established a district data leadership team whose role was to prepare data for review, develop visual data displays, and serve as the lead learners who would learn about key data use practices and then disseminate these throughout the district. The membership of the leadership team included a district technology coordinator, the district curriculum coordinator, the district K-8 literacy coach, 2 lead teachers from each school, 2 principals, and 2 guidance counselors. In its first year, the team focused on learning about data use practices in the schools. To build their own knowledge base, the whole team attended 2 summer trainings run by the State Department of Education, one on using data in schools, based on the book, The Data Coach's Guide, which we mentioned earlier, and the other on data-based dialogue, based on Bruce Wellman and Laura Lipton's book, Data-Driven Dialogue, A Facilitator's Guide to Collaborative Inquiry. The team then committed to meeting monthly throughout the school year to accomplish and discuss results on the following tasks. They met with all the teachers in the district by meeting with grade-level teams in each school, and they discussed their current data use practices. They developed an assessment map documenting current assessments in use at each grade level and school, and created an assessment inventory of available data for program and curricular review. They researched how high-performing schools use data, and then researched data management systems to replace or complement their current student information system. They learned how to analyze commonly used data in preparation for teaching teachers, how they might streamline their analyses. They analyzed issues and prepared a report on data collection and data quality in the district, and made recommendations to the superintendent and school board related to new technology and staffing to support database practices. They prepared the state assessment data reports. They created teacher focus groups to give feedback to the district data leadership team in particular, twice during the year. And they worked with school leaders to establish data use role expectations for the principals, and then sent principals to a 5-day summer institute on how to lead data use. As I continue to describe the district's activities in year 2, consider the question I posed earlier about how they addressed ensuring access to data and clarifying expectations. Just jot those into the chat box as I describe year 2. So in year 2, the district data leadership team's efforts grew out of their learning and research from the first year of work. The team revised the assessment map they had developed the previous year to include consistent common assessments that they were going to develop across schools for every grade level and subject area. They created a plan for introducing several new student assessment tools the following year to address assessment gaps they had identified the year before. They developed new job descriptions for the technology director and the curriculum director to focus more on discrete aspects of data systems and data use. They established new guidance on the principal's role in data use, and they incorporated this into the principal's job description. They provided guidance and direction to a newly hired part-time data entry clerk. They continued to solicit feedback from teacher focus groups at each school twice a year regarding their data use and the professional development needs that were emerging. They developed a partnership with the state university to run an assessment literacy course for interested teachers at a reduced cost and with available graduate credits. They worked with principals to identify lead teachers who would receive intensive professional development to support their ability to lead data teams at their schools. And they continued to advocate for a data warehouse system by creating a written justification for the expense and presented this to the town finance committee during budget negotiations. So I'm just scanning the chat box and noting some of the practices that you have picked up that this school pursued, defining job and role descriptions in relation to data use. And then obviously the complementary piece to that is supporting leaders in having the knowledge and skills to then do that work. They definitely fostered a collaborative approach across levels, and this was modeled first at the district level, reaching out to principals and to teacher leaders. Their first act was to go and meet with every teacher in their teacher teams. That was a significant message to schools and set the stage for the collaborative work that was going to take place. I think one of the critical leadership behaviors here that occurred early on was just to establish this district data leadership team. And that team's charge was to do a lot of learning during the first year about the practices that were already taking place in the district and then how to build out from those. Some of the critical behaviors that ensured access to data included preparing easily accessible data reports and engaging in data analysis themselves so they could then help teachers gain efficiencies in their own data analysis. And they investigated, then actively advocated for a data warehouse system as well as for new staff to support accurate and timely data entry. To clarify expectations for data use, some of the core behaviors included revising those job descriptions to make those expectations more clear and explicit, and leading data use and leading data use, and conveying to teachers that their responsibilities for data use by providing access to an assessment literacy course, identifying teachers to lead data teams, instituting common assessments. They really worked at all levels to clarify the expectations for data use.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the third element, which is related to making meaning from data. And the third and fourth elements provide easy entry points for schools because they focus squarely on teachers' use of data for instructional decision-making. Research has shown that there is value to collaborative inquiry-based teams. And if teams use a collective structured process that involves asking meaningful questions about student learning, analyzing increasingly nuanced data to understand more about student progress, and develop, implement, and learn from the results of instructional responses, then they are more likely to make a difference in student achievement and also teacher learning. Teams can be structured in various ways, and so we'd like to note here that they can be both subject area and grade level teams, which is more common in terms of how educational teams are structured, where data analysis is focused on common expectations among teachers who teach all the same grade level or the same content. But teams can also be structured as vertical or cross-subject area teams. This is one of the ways that we have found recommendations for rural schools where there might only be one teacher per class per grade level. The use of vertical teams or cross-subject area teams helps teachers develop and also align curricular expectations because then they can talk to the teacher from the grade before and also the teacher in the grade after, and they can review how their instructional practices develop over those grade levels as students progress from first grade, second grade, third grade, etc. So one of the recommendations that we found for a rural or a small school is to encourage vertical or cross-subject teaming. But when teams meet together, it's also important to give them some way or support to make meaning from the data. One of the best ways we found to do this is to provide guidance in terms of protocols and templates. And we are both very big fans of protocols and templates, and this is one of our favorites. It comes from Nancy Love's Data Coach's Guide as well. It's called Data-Driven Dialogue, and it comes originally from Wellman and Lipton, but was adapted by Nancy Love as an example of a clearly structured approach to engaging a team and building their understanding from student learning data. So when teams meet together, they need to have a purpose and structure. And using a protocol provides them with that structure by beginning with the process of predicting what they think they will see, which surfaces their prior knowledge and assumptions, and moves to looking at a visual display. And the recommendation here is either they should be provided a visual display or have some time to create one themselves. This helps people make sense of the data instead of looking at tables or charts that are filled with numbers. This invites broader engagement with the data and also helps the team members identify patterns and an emerging story in the data. Then team members are asked to generate observations from the data, including what they notice and what patterns they're starting to see. And then finally, the fourth phase is about generating inferences and raising questions that may or may not be answered by the data and starting to draw conclusions. But it's important to observe that the structure of this protocol, and probably several others that you might have used, starts with the observation phase where you point out what you see before you draw your conclusions. And it's very explicit about the order so that teachers can build a shared meaning and norms of safety and trust. And they'll learn that when they notice or observe something about the data, it is not based solely on a team member's assumptions or interpretations, but actually they're learning a habit, a culture of looking at what they see. Some other examples to help educators with making meaning from data include finding ways to facilitate building level discussions of their own progress. So what are some key areas of focus that we've been following over time? We have to support the idea that educators must make meaning of multiple forms of evidence. So not only that standardized testing data, but also student work. So we need opportunities for them to bring together multiple forms of data. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat the idea of the power of the intersections among data sources. And another idea is to create and lead data retreats, maybe full professional development sessions when you do have the time, in order to maximize the amount of time that teachers spend together. So those were some examples of guidance that we've read about and heard about from the research and our own practice. But we'd also like to point you to a resource that we developed here at the REL Northeastern Islands, which is the counterpart to this workshop that you're engaging in right now. This is the Practitioner Data Use in Schools Workshop Toolkit. And the idea for the toolkit is it's a free resource. You can download it from this link. It contains a facilitator guide and handouts. And the objective of this workshop is to help teams of practitioners engage in a data inquiry cycle. So it provides suggestions about protocols, handouts, and tools for each step of the cycle. And there is also a self-paced online version of the workshop that you can follow along, and it's a good way to introduce the data inquiry process to staff. So in summary, you'll notice that this element is all about providing opportunities for people to examine, interpret, and raise questions about data. Leaders who are able to support their educators in this phase create structures like teams and supports from coaches or peers who serve as resources. They make the data work visible. For example, they might post it, posting findings in data walls or data rooms, and then they set aside whole school time, but not just at the beginning of the year, not just when your standardized testing data comes in from last year and we have a whole school meeting, not just once, but at multiple times through the year where you can engage as a school in conversations about how your students are doing.
We'll move now to the fourth element of the culture of data use, building knowledge and skills. In a 2009 study of data use practices in U.S. schools, researchers identified two major barriers that teachers cited to implementing data use: a lack of preparation on how to use data, and a lack of technical skills on the staff for how to use data systems. Teachers' level of individual skills and knowledge is really essential to being able to make meaning from data in collaborative teams. Professional development for data use helps teachers develop data literacy as well as assessment literacy skills, and critically can help them to practice how to move from data analysis to using that information to improve instructional practice. Some researchers suggest that data literacy for teachers must necessarily be differentiated by content area because the kind of data that teachers are asked to interpret differs from grade to grade and across curriculum areas. In a 2010 study, only half of the districts surveyed provided training to teachers on how to use data to inform instructional practice. And a majority of teachers wanted more training on how to interpret data and connect it to their classroom instruction. Researchers in 2010 noted that when a district did not embed data use and associated learning opportunities in the regular workday, teachers opted out of data use practices entirely because of the additional work entailed. Central office leaders appear to be a main provider of professional development for data use and have a particular focus on helping school staff build capacity to use evidence. Researchers Datnow, Park, and Wolstetter recommended in their 2007 study that district leaders engage in professional development themselves and then provide turnkey training to district and school staff as needed. This is a strategy for building internal capacity as well as for developing consistent practices that will cross all the schools in the district. One example of school-developed guidance to support building data use knowledge and skills is a data team calendar, such as this excerpt, which outlines when the data team will collect, analyze, and use data to support improved teaching and learning. This school data team meets biweekly. For example, this plan not only notes the specific tasks for each month's meetings, but indicates the other educators with whom they'll be interacting, such as the common planning teams or the staff meetings and the school leadership team. So a data team calendar can lay out the professional learning that occurs within the team, as well as how the team will help to build the knowledge and skills of others within the school and contribute to that information flow that we talked about earlier back up to the central office. Other examples of ways to build knowledge and skills include providing funding, expertise, and training for varied data use practices across the district, providing professional learning for principals to use data at the building level and with teachers and teacher teams, and providing ongoing learning to a cadre of teacher leaders who can lead data teams in grade level and departmental configurations. So some key takeaways about this element of a culture of data use are to embed the professional learning in the daily work of teachers and to sustain attention to and supports for the application of this learning toward changes in the classroom. It can't stop at just data analysis. Further, professional learning should attend to both data literacy and assessment literacy and should integrate this learning with the development of specific content knowledge and relevant instructional strategies because teachers need to weave these together, these sources of knowledge, to make effective changes to instruction. So attend to building data and assessment literacy in tandem with specific content knowledge and associated instructional strategies.
Okay, we're going to move on to the last vignette about our rural school. And as we do that, we'd like you to think about the two elements we just covered. So the school-based entry points for building a culture of data use are making meaning from data and building knowledge and skills. So as I go through these vignettes, this vignette, please take a moment and think about where you see these elements happening in this rural district. So this is a high-achieving K-8 rural school, and it came to the attention of the author because they were doing such good work and had fairly positive achievement results for their students. And so we're going to think about what the elements of building knowledge and skills might look like in practice here. So this was a high-achieving rural K-8 school. They did not have access to data coaches, or external staff who can lead data practices. So they instead began intensive work with the staff that they did have, including teacher teams and the school leadership team, about 7 years ago. They focused early on to build teacher teams' capacity for using student data, including teacher-developed benchmark assessments and diagnostic and progress monitoring tools. As before, teacher teams were organized in multi-grade groups. So again, the vertical teaming strategy here. One for K through 2, kindergarten through grade 2, one for grades 3 through 5, and one for grades 6 through 8. And they incorporated subject area teachers and special education teachers in each of these teams. Their leader, their principal, found time for them to meet weekly for 75 minutes. And they used data analysis protocols to review student assessment data and plan for next steps for instruction. So that protected time, again, shows up here. They spent time on other tasks also related to standards-based instruction and assessment, but they had an additional 45 minutes of scheduled time each week to talk about other topics. So that 75 minutes a week was solely for the purpose of engaging in data inquiry and instructional planning. There was also a school leadership team made up of one person from each of the teacher teams, plus the school principal, to conduct a school review, a close review of the large-scale accountability data that the school was using at the time, and then identifying areas where the entire school could improve. So again, this idea of setting expectations and providing areas of focus and purpose for why we're looking at the data. The school and the principal set annual performance goals related to one or two of those high leverage areas of focus, and some examples of those goals included improving students' academic vocabulary, having teachers develop clear learning objectives, and providing useful feedback to students from each of their assessments. And the principal played a key role in articulating the vision for professional learning at this school and how these goals were going to translate into the work that the principal was doing in school-wide walkthroughs. And the principal created a data collection and observation tool that was used in these walkthroughs, and teachers received feedback on their progress against the goals. And one of the things we do know from the research is the importance of clear and actionable feedback really helps people see what it is they need to do differently. The other things that this school did were to adjust their professional development strategy over time. So the school leadership team pursued various professional learning experiences to strengthen their knowledge and skills, and we see a progression of professional development work that the school pursued over 6 to 7 years of coordinated learning. So that's another key takeaway. When you start this work, don't give up after a year. Keep going. See how it develops. And so some of the things to notice are that the school started off with building their school leadership team's knowledge and then had them share with the staff, where the school leadership team facilitated protocols with teachers and distributed responsibility for facilitating those meetings. But they also involved teachers early on in identifying those areas of focus. As they moved forward in 2009 and 10, the school leadership team then became more interested in helping develop effective benchmark assessments, and teachers participated in conversations about vertical alignment, and they learned about root cause analysis. And then finally, you'll see in the third year, they were really interested in formative assessment and the use of feedback to students. So somebody in this webinar entered in a question that asked about the importance of formative assessment for rural schools. So this district in particular took the idea of formative data very seriously, and they tried to help teachers use peer and self-assessment strategies. So we're going to have you just think about the critical behaviors that you noticed here instead of entering them in for discussion at the end.
Leading for data use is largely consistent with leading for improvement more generally. Studies have shown that leading for data use is strongly focused on issues of teaching and learning, identifying innovative resources to support teachers and teacher leaders, structuring time to attend to issues of teaching and learning, and providing a consistent focus on using evidence to guide instructional improvement. Schools with a high level of data use show more effective practices to support teachers with data use, including ensuring and protecting time for collaborative team meetings, modeling those data use practices with faculty, and tapping the expertise that resides and is growing within the faculty. For example, in 2009, researchers found that using teacher leaders as facilitators during inquiry-based team meetings opened the door for coaches, content experts, and principals to actually take on more informal leadership roles in these meetings. When principals then support teams in sharing their developing strategies for data analysis, it can lead to more effective evidence-based team practices across the school. Looking beyond the school, research also indicates that central office leaders play an important role in developing a culture of data use. They can frame key messages, provide resources and supports for school-wide data use implementation. They can convene cross-school groups to streamline data use practices, and they can develop strategies to build capacity for data use over time. A central focus of those in the central office is to support principals to use data themselves. Studies have shown that if the central office implements models in which principals are held accountable to use data, there's an overall positive impact on the principal's use and comfort with data, which positions them to lead data use more effectively in their schools. And remember that leadership for data use is not a one-way street, nor is it only top-down. Leaders contribute to both top-down and bottom-up flow of information with the central office, playing a responsive role, ensuring that useful, accessible, relevant, timely data are provided to schools and teachers to make meaningful improvements to teaching and learning. The development of this plan here for the first-year implementation of a rural middle school data team was supported initially by an outside consultant, but then was overseen by school leaders, including the data team members themselves, who led all of the embedded professional learning and faculty presentations. Notice the specificity of this plan, which states the primary goal of the team and the core activities and focus points for the data team. In addition, the plan describes 4 data-focused engagements that would take place with common planning teams during the year. These were designed to help teachers learn how to analyze and use different types of evidence of student learning. So other examples of leading a culture of data use might include typically many supports for principals, such as addressing principal leadership in a structured way to build both knowledge of data use and knowledge of leading data use, requiring principals to use data and holding them accountable for doing so over time, and facilitating opportunities for principals to tune or calibrate their data use practices to build consistency and coherence across schools. Facilitating partnerships between principals and their school and teacher leaders is also important to collaboratively construct data use guidance at the school level and plan relevant professional learning. So leading a culture of data use highlights district and school leaders as the lead learners who must consistently convey and model constructive, non-punitive uses of data with a focus on supporting improvements in instruction and student learning. Their key role is to establish safe and supportive conditions for data use, while also building in accountability for the application of developing knowledge and skills toward a continuous improvement across classrooms. So to do this, they must attend strategically to all other elements of the culture of data use framework, ensuring access to data, clarifying expectations for data use, making meaning from data, and building knowledge and skills for data use.
So we have come to a point where we would love to get your reflections on the 5 elements. And I mentioned at the beginning that the idea with these elements in this framework is to give you a place to organize your thinking and to consider which of these elements you might be doing well with, but which elements should receive more focused attention. So we have 2 polls up right now, and we'd like you to fill both of them in at the same time. Which of these elements is a strength in your context? And then which should receive more focused attention, in your opinion? And as we've gone through, we've provided you with some examples from the districts that we and the authors of the toolkit have worked with. Think about, do you have a clear set of expectations at your school or your district? Do you have clearly defined roles and timelines for looking at data? when teacher teams or data leadership teams meet together, do they have protocols, agendas, and a structured way to organize their thinking? Do you have a professional development plan for what knowledge and skills teachers and leaders need in order to make responsible inferences and to be able to make instructional decisions from that data? And is there a way to get access to the data that you need, understanding that sometimes access does not always mean access to standardized testing data, but access to data that teachers have and are generating every single day from their classrooms? Student work, formative assessment data, student homework, classroom conversations, maybe, written documents of what has happened in classrooms. That data teachers have access to already, and it is the kind of data that we don't pay attention to enough, but gives us probably the most information about what our students are learning. So looking at the poll here, it looks like most people find that they have strengths in making meaning from data, which is a really interesting element to choose. That's the one about protocols and discussion prompts and organizing collaborative work. I'm really heartened by that. I'm really hopeful that the word has gotten out there that collaborative inquiry-based learning is the way to go. It does seem like, in terms of which element should receive more focused attention, this issue of leadership seems to be coming up. Having a set of leaders in the building who can maybe do some of those things like provide protected time or establish those role expectations or create calendars for data use across an academic year. Those might be some things to consider. How can you strengthen that practice? So we'll move on now and go to another kind of reflection question, or reflection point, and then another question, sorry. So in terms of parting thoughts, we'd like to offer that this whole idea of the framework is all about system integration, that when you decide to create a culture of data use, you really need coordination. And the authors of the toolkit actually emphasize that it's not about starting in the right place, because you can really start in any one of the 5 elements. But they recommend that if you have a foundation of leadership to drive the work, you will get the furthest in terms of leaders setting the conditions and expectations for the other 4 elements. But you really need to attend to all 5 elements at all levels of the system, from the central office down to the principal and the administrative team at the schools, to the teachers and the related service and support providers, in order to really get that culture that functions as data use being integrated when nobody is looking. It's just the way that we do business. And also, we'd like to remind you that data use expectations should change over time. This is really a developmental activity. And the slide we put up at the beginning, which focuses on the various stages, demonstrates that you do start with teachers looking at data for reasons maybe related to deciding what to teach and whom to teach. But then as you get more sophisticated with data, it really is about translating that information into how you should be teaching, what instructional moves should you be doing, and then even further into an inquiry into how students are learning and how can we use data and how can they use data, the students themselves, as immediate feedback on their own learning. And we'd like you to just consider how you will support a data using culture that will move you developmentally into stages 3 and 4 over time. So now we're going to end with a chat, and if you have any questions at this point, this would be another good time to put it into the chat box and we can take your questions. So looking forward, we would love to hear from you. What did you plan to do differently as a result of this session? Was there an idea that really resonated with you, or a piece of the examples or the guidance that stood out that you would like to try, or a recommendation from one of the vignettes that a previous district had tried that you think is a really good idea? What do you plan to do differently? And I would also encourage you, for more information, please do download the toolkit because it's full of examples. And one of the ideas that we've had in doing this webinar is, in its in-person format, is getting teachers to talk about these case studies and say, oh, that sounds like something we could do here, or this is a practice, but I don't know how we could start that. And they can have a conversation about the best place to start. It helps to see another district that has done it, and also over time. It's not just a snapshot of 1 year, but the example we provided of the rural K-8 school really did this work for 6 to 7 years. As a result, they built their data using culture over time. So what do people plan to do differently as a result of the session? I don't see any comments in the chat, so I'll put up the other one while others are typing. And then you can consider that one as well. But we do want to hear from you what resonates with you, or what will you take away. What will you share with others from this session? Is there a particular finding from the research or an example from the vignettes? So Marianne, thank you. The data use elements are a great resource and guide. The author of the toolkit, the authors of the toolkit, as I said, mentioned this is a framework for thinking, framework for organizing your thinking. If you can remember the 5 elements and use it as a way to examine your own setting, it's a good organizational tool. It is based in research and also based in work with schools. Sam is taking away a protocol for discussions around data. Sam, we do love those protocols. Data-driven dialogue is one of our favorite protocols, and you can find several other resources for that if you download the practitioner guide that I had mentioned earlier. Yes, Sue is pointing out to download the practitioner data use toolkit, which is full of different protocols and recommendations. Thanks, Jamie. Jamie's going to be sharing the toolkit and the framework at a data system meeting. That is fantastic. That is a good place for the work to start. Jamie, I'm not sure who is at your data system meetings. That could be really interesting, given our focus on setting expectations and distributing roles for data use. So if you want to type that in, I would love to hear about that. Jacinda says, I'd like to meet with my principal to inquire about setting aside specific time to have data discussions. Absolutely. I think it's hard without discussing with your school administrators about changes in schedules. This is a perfect time of year to start talking about changes in schedules for next year. And we know that many of you don't have that much time left in this academic year, but if you start those conversations now, you can have a master schedule for next year that provides that protected time. Beryl mentions sharing data elements is also good to share with the accountability department. We've worked with several central office people who are in the accountability and data departments, and we're finding increasingly that school districts are organizing accountability and data along with their professional development departments and having them talk to each other more, because it's becoming more important that the professional development side of the district knows what data and accountability, what data is coming in, not just for accountability, but for learning. Sam is asking, any resources specifically for independent schools? I don't think any come to mind for me. If anybody out there in the world knows of one, feel free to put that in. I would also go back to saying the culture of data use framework comes from research across several schools and is really about those elements of culture that are really not specific to any setting. So it's a good question, though. Sarah, would you mind if I included it as a resource for a presentation at the spring convening? I'm not sure what spring convening you're mentioning, Sarah, but these are publicly available and free resources. So these are meant to be shared. Any questions that have come up for others in addition to these chat questions that I put here on the screen? Other questions that might have come up for you as you were listening in? Marianne earlier had said we are looking for other ideas about data activities. Marianne, I would also recommend definitely downloading the practitioner guide, the Data Coaches Guide by Nancy Love and her colleagues is a resource, as is DataWise by Catherine Baudet, Liz City, and Richard Murnane. Those are all kind of our go-to resources. Any other questions that we can address before we wrap up here? think we might have gotten most of them either in the chat or addressed out loud. So we'll go ahead and move on then, just wrapping up. Our summary today was that we are going to help our participants understand how the framework can help leaders and really everybody in rural districts develop more effective practices, policies, and guidelines that support systemic data use over time to explore those 5 elements using examples from rural schools and districts, and then for you to consider possible strategies to strengthen those 5 elements in your settings. So we would love to have your feedback. It is really important to us in our practice and also to help us design these further professional learning experiences for you. So please do take this survey. It shouldn't take you very long. It's very short, and it's linked here and also at the bottom. Jacinda is asking in the chat, can I get a link to the DataWise materials? There is not one link, but if you put that word into Google, you can definitely come up with the DataWise website. And the authors are Baudet, City, and Murnane, which I will put in the chat. So please do take the survey, give us some feedback about what you thought, and thank you so much for your attention, your engagement in the chat, your great ideas, and your helping us understand your context. And we look forward to seeing you in future events. If you need to email us, our contact information is here at the end. On behalf of